How does a baby go from babbling to full sentences? And why is it so much harder to learn a second language as an adult? Well, in this episode, we're unpacking the science of language acquisition, how our brains are wired to learn language, what theories explains the process, and why your ability to acquire language may have an expiration date. From Chomsky's language acquisition device to the power of social interaction, we'll explore what makes human communication so unique and how understanding it can change the way we teach, learn, and connect. So, whether you're a parent, educator, lifelong learner, this episode will give you a new appreciation for the invisible miracle of language unfolding in our conversation. So, let's unlock what we learn to speak starting now. All right, so I'm here with Shannon, Craig, and Matthew to learn all about language acquisition. And let's just start from the beginning. What is language?
So George, you mentioned Chomsky earlier. He's the theorist that proposed that language is innate and unique to humans with a universal grammar that underlines all languages. So again, something unique for us as human beings. It's got universal grammar, and that underlines the different languages.
Oh, and Matthew, you're connected with the deaf community, and would it be language still defined the same way because we communicate a little different, right? Would it still be? Can we still use that same definition that Noam Chomsky brought up many years ago?
So just to give you a bit of background, because I'm sure you guys have seen all the episodes with Shannon and Craig, and so you know who they are now. My name is Matt. George mentioned. Currently, I work as an instructional designer here at LAPU. But before that, I was an education specialist for 8 years, and my primary population was deaf and hard of hearing students. So the idea of language acquisition, how to teach language, language deprivation, all of that was something that I dealt with on a daily basis. So back to your question, George, can we define it the same way? I would say yes, offhand, because again, we're talking about the idea of language, not the idea of speech, not the idea of communication.
Great point.
So language is something that is universal to all humans, but it's not universal to other species, so to speak. And then there's spoken, and I would make a differentiation between spoken language and sign languages, but it's still language, right? So you still have the concept of language itself. So the idea that it's in a human and how Noam Chomsky defines it, I would say still applies to sign language as well.
That's super interesting because when Noam Chomsky came out with his theories of language acquisition device, and there's literally an expiration date on that to expand your ability to learn language, to be able to speak clearly or learn vocabulary words, whatever it may be. He says that there's actually an expiration date on that. So what do we think are some of the components of learning language that we should check in on to make sure that none of our expiration dates hit? Especially, we'll talk about learning second languages in a little bit, but make sure we don't expire there, right? Because we all want to keep getting smarter.
So B.F. Skinner, is one of the theories is the behaviorist theory. B.F. Skinner argues that language is learned through reinforcement and imitation, that those are the two fundamental pieces. So for Matthew, when you think of the deaf community, is that still in alignment?
It is. I would say there's a critical period to learning language. I don't know if there's an expiration date per se, but there's definitely a time frame where you can learn language the best. So like if you take a deaf student, right? So let's backtrack a little bit. Most deaf kids are born to hearing parents, like 90 to 95% of deaf kids are born to hearing parents. So what happens with that is that the critical time period for them learning the language usually is missed out on. So from in the womb all the way to birth to the first few years of development, there's not a lot of language learning happening, not directly, indirectly, whether it's structured or unstructured, like incidental learning, a lot of things like that are not happening. And what I mean by incidental learning is really not formal, unstructured. It's like It's like when you sit down with your grandma and your grandma's going over traditions that your family does. That's
So
kind of
true.
like incidental learning.
Yeah.
And you talk about it,
Ooh.
you're forming connections, you're making all these meaning, you're making meaning from these things, and your neurons are firing and all these things are happening. So that goes back to B.F. Skinner, right, where behavior, and then Vygotsky too, where it's like a socialization thing. But I wouldn't put a cap on it, because I've had students come in, they're severely language deprived, but then they're learning language. They're starting to get an L1. But I would say, yeah, there's not a strict cap, but there is a critical period that is like the best time frame, I
the,
would
the,
say.
the spot. So would you say, let me ask you a question then with that, because like learning how to do, I'll use sports, play baseball. My grandson's playing baseball right now, and he was really bad when he started. I mean, he was really bad. He didn't, nobody ever taught him to play baseball. And I love baseball. Shame on me for just being the grandpa. But we went out there and would spend just hours playing catch once he started to like baseball. And he never did it, never played it till he was 9. But then when he started, we would spend that time out there just throwing and goofing off, having fun. You know, he learned it really, really quickly. So his learning curve was like really fast. So the incremental gains that he made in the beginning were incredible. You see that when people come in that they were language deprived, but then they get into this. Now, can we call it language rich when they were coming into your class to learn?
That's a great way to describe it. So it is a language rich environment. That's exactly what you would call it, because you come in and you want to just immerse them and bombard them right away, because you're not only teaching language, but you're teaching socialization, you're teaching behavior, you're teaching a lot of different things that are kind of tied to this. And to go back to your point about where he hit a point for that skill, if you think about cognition and a language, they're tied, but it really doesn't define your cognition. Like, it doesn't define your ability to think. So like, if I have a lot of students who may be language deprived, but they're great at putting puzzles together, they're great at doing things visually. Maybe they're not able to label it. Maybe they're not able to do things in certain aspects, but that doesn't mean their ability to think has gone away. Now, if there's other disabilities attached to that, where it's like a deaf plus child, where they have deaf plus this, plus that, there's other factors in that. But I would say that in terms of language acquisition, can you hit a ceiling? I mean, maybe, but like, you never can stop learning in that aspect. You know what I mean? There's no rule that says, oh, now all of a sudden I'm done learning. Now I'm 65 years old. I'm done learning the language. No, it's just harder, maybe, but it's not capped, I would say. I don't know if you guys would agree with that.
Yeah, well, it's one of the theories that we talk about is critical period hypotheses, and that's CPH. George mentioned that. That's Chomsky's theory, but it was built on by Eric Lemberg in 1967. And Lemberg talks about this biological window from birth to puberty where language acquisition occurs most easily and naturally. So it doesn't mean you can't do it later, but that's the easiest time. And they've done a lot of studies. This is kind of fascinating. Look at feral children who were, brought up without any human interaction. And they find if they weren't exposed to any language during their childhood, they really struggle later in life to be able to learn it. So it doesn't mean that you can't learn it. It just means that there's a critical window of time where it's really easy to learn that. And then once you've passed that critical window, which according to these theorists is after puberty, then it's going to be much more difficult and that's oftentimes why they teach multiple languages in school today.
Yeah.
Because they know when you're a young person, it's easier to pick that up. If you wait till later in life to learn a second language, it takes a lot more time. You can still do it, but it's much more difficult than if you do it when you're younger.
I have a question for you guys, and it kind of goes back to, George, what you were saying about your grandson. Once he started practicing baseball, he was able to take off with it. And also, Matthew, I want you to chime in as well, too, because my question for you is specifically associated with language, right? So there's going to be language terminology specifically about baseball. And so that has to do with the culture of baseball, too, right? So you might tell your grandson that he needs to, he's up to bat what does up to bat mean unless you understand the baseball culture, right? And this kind of goes with what we were talking about in our last podcast too, and chunking things together and concepts. But my question to pose to you is, how does culture and society influence the languages that we use? And that can be in small cultural sections like the culture of baseball, going up to bat, that type of thing.
Right.
And it can be larger too. My husband served with a mission organization in the Dominican Republic for several years. And so Spanish in the DR is different than Spanish that I spoke in Mexico. Not that I'm fluent, I wish I was, but the Spanish that I spoke in the DR versus Mexico versus in the United States, it's different. So tell me, how does the culture impact the language that we are learning?
You want to jump in on that one,
I
Matthew?
don't know. I wasn't sure who was going to go first. I would say language and culture plays a huge impact on everything, including language.
Right.
Really, how you talk, how you speak, how you interact, how you kind of say things, and then really providing a good background. For like, let's take back baseball, right? I had a student because I used to teach 3rd through 5th grade, and then I taught 9th through 12th. I had a student when I was in high school. He was a baseball player, deaf baseball player. He was really good. Of course, he did have language deprivation and stuff like that. But phrases like that, up to bat, he picked up a lot quicker because he was immersed in that context.
Right.
Foul ball, pop fly, different things like that, different things that are more analogies, idioms in relation to baseball. He understood because he was hearing it repeated again and again and again. So it was drilled into him. Oh, a pop fly means the ball is going up. It's going to come down. Somebody needs to catch it to get it out. And the out means this, and this. And he can apply those extra meanings to it. Now, whereas I had another student, never played any sports, and he told him pop fly. He's like, what the heck are you talking about? Is something breaking? Is something popping?
Right.
What does that mean? You know what I mean?
Is there a fly that you're trying to hit?
Yeah. And then like there's culture language too. There's like words specifically related to the culture for certain things too, where and then you also get into regional words as well. Like New York has certain phrases that we don't use here in California. That just gave everybody, I'm from California, so like whoever's watching, yeah. There's certain things that we say here too that are not said in New York. And then there's different ways you say that as well. So culture does play a big part with making meaning, with giving you background knowledge, and then really just kind of how you frame things as well. Because I could say something like there's been phrases that I've heard from like somebody who came from the Midwest. I can't think of one right now, but they said a phrase and I was like, what are you talking about? What do you mean?
Right.
Like, that means like five. Yeah, that means like 5 different things to me. I don't get it. I'm lost.
What are we talking about?
But that's related to the culture. And it's not that I don't understand the language that he's saying. It's just I don't understand the meaning behind it.
Right. That's the critical part, is the meaning that we learn from the culture. And again, this is Vygotsky got this right when he was talking about the social cultural influences, right? So you just target that. Actually, so everyone knows out there, I just used baseball. George did, and Matthew, I didn't know they all had experience in this. So this is great that your student actually had all this experience in baseball. What a great example of the one student who did and did not into the language that they acquired associated with the baseball terminology. That is just such a great example of that. Can I ask you some other questions, Matthew and Craig and George? So there's different linguistic theories, and I kind of want to hear your thoughts on this. So there's linguistic determination, right? And so that just means that language determines thought. That's one school of thought. This has mostly been discredited. So if you say that's what you think, then we want to hear your case for this. The other is linguistic relativity, and that has to do that language influences thought, right? And then we go down to cognitive primacy, which we think of Piaget with this, right? And so that is that cognition precedes and shapes our language. And then there is, of course, interactionist view, which think of your cognition and language working in tandem with one another. So of those different theoretical approaches to language acquisition and cognition, Which of those four do you think stand out as being most empirically strong? Again, if you say the first one, determinism, I really need to hear your facts on that one. But the other ones, I just want to hear your opinions on them.
What were the last two?
So we have cognitive primacy, and then, well, we're thinking of Vygotsky again, but it is, they're phrasing it as interactionist view because of the working in tandem together. So think of your cognition and language kind of working in tandem together. So what are your thoughts on those?
Go for it, man. I see you leaning in, man.
Well, because I don't want to jump in for anybody.
Jump.
So this podcast, right, for educators, students, and everything. So if you're an educator, you're going to know about Piaget, you're going to know about Vygotsky, even Skinner, and all that. Because usually you do a child and adolescent development program, or CDE, or not CDE, for the littles. Now I'm blanking on the term, but it's for the littles, and you can do that, and you learn all about that development. So it's a mixture, not of I lean more towards linguistic relativity. Then you have Piaget stages, and also socialization. I really believe language is not learned alone, which is why you get children, right? When they're just isolated, they don't learn language. But when you're socialized, you're learning language, you're learning the culture, you're learning all of that. So I do have a strong stake in Vygotsky in some senses for that piece, but also in terms of like how cognition works with language. I think they're connected, but it's not necessarily dependent on each other in terms of cognition and how well you think. Like I said, I've had students come in who maybe don't know a lot of language, but like they know how to do things. You know what I mean? They're aware of what is and what isn't. If there's not other disabilities going on, you know what I mean? Because there's brilliant deaf people out there who maybe were language deprived when they were younger, but as soon as they started getting that language exposure and they developed a strong I'm going to say L1, it means your first language. So L1, then they learn an L2, which is being bilingual, L3, trilingual. And then they go on and they get their PhDs and they're communicating in different languages because they finally got that language exposure. So there was not anything else going on and their cognition was fine. They just needed that exposure. But then there's the flip side, right? Where I'm going to throw this out there. I'm going to come back to it because I do want to answer your question. So I do think linguistic relativity, that it does influence how you think. I have to revisit the stages. I know there's 4 stages. I don't remember them offhand for Piaget, but I have to revisit that. But I do know that in terms of cognition, socialization does play a part. So I do agree with that. I don't think language determines the way you think, though. I don't think it's like a I learned English, now I'm only thinking in English. Now I'm only thinking that way. I learned Spanish, now I'm only stuck to Spanish. Because I have an aunt, her first language is, she has 2 first languages. First one is ASL, because my grandfather's deaf. Okay. So my aunt, her dad, that's obviously her dad, her first language is ASL and English. She sometimes has told me that she's dreamed in English, ASL. She's had thoughts in ASL. And then she's had thoughts in different kind of ways that make no sense. Because sometimes you don't think in words, you just think.
Can you tell everyone what, I know what it means, but they might not know what ASL means. Can you tell them?
American Sign Language. Sorry, thank you. So there's tons of sign languages. I don't know the direct amount. I think it's actually mentioned in the book how many there are. But there's a lot. There's not just one ASL, one sign language or sign languages.
Right.
So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's great because you gave examples for each of them to like why you would support this approach versus another, and like why we aren't stuck with linguistic indetermination because we realize that's not super credible. But anyone, sorry, go ahead, Craig.
I'm just going to jump in, Shannon, and just
please do.
There's this concept that we talk about a lot at LAPU, and it's called evidence-based practices. And George Hanshaw is one of the people that continues to bring us back to it. Let me tell you why. There's a lot of theories out there that were developed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but when we do research studies, the evidence doesn't support them. And so as academics, we've got to challenge that and say, well, if the evidence isn't supporting that theory, Is the theory valid? So in response to your question, Shannon, Vygotsky's theory on social interaction and scaffolding has been the most supported by the research. And it's widely accepted in psychology, education, and language acquisition studies. And so the reason for that is because the empirical research support. So this evidence-based practice means that we've done numerous studies over and over again to confirm that children learn language and cognitive skills more effectively through interaction with adults and peers than in isolation. And then the research on also looks at cooperative learning and teacher-student interaction also supports Vygotsky's ideas. So if you're just looking at the evidence and we're looking at research, Vygotsky is oftentimes high on the list. That doesn't mean that the others aren't valid. It just means that up to this point, that's where the research has really supported us in terms of looking at that. And I think to me, that makes a lot of sense on a personal level, because as I think back to my learning, it's always around social interactions. And I'm always picking up cues on what's socially acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I think that was the process of learning for me. As a young person, I went to Christian schools, and they used discipline. And I went through a lot of that discipline. If I wasn't following the social order and I wasn't behaving in the right ways, I had discipline. And so, and a lot of that has to do with language too. What was the language I was using, or the terminology? And so again, I tend to lean towards Vygotsky and this notion of just social learning and the powerful impact that we have through educators, teachers, in my experience. I'll give you one other example. I had a lot of teachers giving me negative feedback throughout my early childhood years because I acted out in many cases. But I had this one teacher, Mr. Langer, in 8th grade. And Mr. Langer would actually put positive comments on my papers. And it was the first time I was actually not just getting red comments, I was getting positive comments. And he motivated me and he encouraged me. And through that social interaction with him, I became inspired to be that kind of person. I said, I want to be the kind of person that's going to encourage people and lift them up and focus on the positives that they're achieving. So that's just a little bit of my story.
That's right.
And can I piggyback on that a little bit? Because I think you bring up a great point. Everybody's been talking about Vygotsky, and I'm thinking, so if you speak that language of the others around you, you're more likely to be accepted as well.
Yes.
So you get that feeling of acceptance from, the people around you. Yeah. What was that, Shannon? I'm sorry.
Belonging,
Belonging. Yeah.
we know based on evidence, is incredibly important.
Yeah. So and you all gave me a light bulb moment as I thought about this. So regardless of the language, how you use it within your context. So you're going to speak English in Louisiana, but it's going to sound a little bit different than out here in California, right?
Right.
We're not talking gator rolls out here in California, where you might in Louisiana, right? And if you don't know what those terms mean, you're not accepted as readily until you kind of figure that out. That's all right. That's super interesting. You all got me going on a rabbit trail now, so I appreciate that super much. So acceptance and belong. So language directly connects to acceptance and belonging.
For sure.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes.
I'm sure Matthew can speak deeply to these kids who might have felt as like outsiders, but went to a school where other kids there are also in the similar deaf community. I was looking at my words to make sure I use my words, Matthew. But in the similar community, there's that sense of belonging. So can you speak to that a little bit further?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's totally true. So with all the students, the way I taught was in a mainstream environment. So I had my own individual classroom. It was STC,
Okay.
which meant I had all the students with me, but they also mainstreamed out. So they would go out with interpreters. They would go out for a certain amount of minutes. They were also pulled out for our different resources. So speech, AVT, and we could talk. These are all different things that we could talk about, whether they work or not. but I'm just letting you know what was being used.
What-
They had OT, occupational therapy, different things like that.
Mhm.
I noticed this mostly in high school too, because in high school is where you're kind of finding yourself, your
Identity formation.
exactly all of
Mhm.
that. Whenever they would go out and they would be involved in the mainstream environment, if there wasn't another deaf student there,
Mm,
usually they were more withdrawn. Usually. Now, this is not always a like
sure, it's not all or
this is
nothing.
absolutely not, yeah.
Right.
But you can see a difference in terms of engagement. You can see a difference in terms of how they felt involved. And then if the teacher wasn't like super like engaged in trying to withdraw them out, you would just have a student that would sit there and be very passive. And then you get them in that classroom environment. They're like, bah, 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 bah. Signs coming out and everything. You're like, bro, why aren't you doing this in Mr. B's class or whatever? Like, you're so brilliant. You couldn't share. I was like, I have to tell the interpreter. That's tell them. I'm like, I don't want to. No thanks.
The
I'm like,
process, right?
yeah, and I get it.
It's a
Because sometimes
process.
you don't even want to talk to the interpreter, and you're like, I have to talk to the interpreter too. And then there's issues too where they're signing with their friends and they're like, hey, don't look at me, interpreter. I don't want this person to know what's going on.
I don't want you to see what we're talking about.
Yeah. Because in some sense, and that's a valid point, because in some senses, if I'm here, I'm a hearing kid and I have another hearing kid, I could whisper two different things to you, nobody else knows. But if I sign it to you, it's in full display, and that's I'm blocking my body to block you, and you're not going to see me. So there's other aspects that are involved with that too. And then in the deaf classroom too, like if I'm sitting, sometimes they will try to hide things from me, but like I can see you, I see what's going on, I see you just made that remark. Like, I'm not blind, you know what I mean? So there's different things that happen there, but they felt connected in the deaf community by a shared language. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So ASL, and when I was first learning about all of this, I had a teacher who would constantly say, and I loved it. He would say, my language is ASL. This is my language. And you could tell, and he had some stories too, but he would say, no, this is mine. And he said, it's not your language, Matthew. This is mine. And I said, you're right. My first language is a spoken language. That's my heritage is English and coming up with that. Your heritage is ASL. That's your language. He's like, I own that. And that's how I am. And it's tied to the deaf community. To deny ASL is to deny the deaf community. And they will fight you tooth and nail, but like, what? No, don't take that away from me.
Howard Giles came up with this concept, building on Vygotsky's theory. He calls it communication accommodation theory, CAT. And what his argument is that people often change their speech to gain approval from others, create distance, and show how the language is used to gain acceptance. So an example is a teenager adopting slang speech to fit in with peers. So I've got a teenage son right now who's 16 years of age, and he's speaking a different language when he comes home to talk to me. He's like, bro.
Like, I'm dad. Thank you.
Yes, but no, I'm bro. But it's not bro, it's bra. And then he says, no, it's actually bra. So he's learning this language, but this is how he's fitting in with other kids. His sophomore year of high school, he's bringing it home, and oftentimes I'm not quite sure what the terminology really means, and so it's been a learning curve for me.
Yeah.
There's this person on some social media, and he teaches junior high students or middle school students, depending on what part of the country you're in. And I was just trying to figure out some of the terminology that my kids are older, so not in this age, and I know people are going to laugh, but things like the skibbity and all these skibbity toilet, I'm like, why? Well, I don't understand this, but that is the language of the middle school child in this current age. But it's so important that we can learn those things from people who are interacting with students all the time, and helps us to become up to date with the current terms. And that goes to what you're speaking to, Craig, here. And I think different parts of the country, we say different things as well, too. And we've talked about that. But I was going to give you an example as well of youth adolescents creating their own language for communication. But so I serve at the state correctional facility for youth, and I do chapel services and things like that. And we're talking about ASL and such. Well, they have created their own type of language that they use with hands that is not ASL, but they use some ASL words, but they've created an alternative language so they can communicate. So guards and such don't know what they're saying. So but it's an adaptation to create a new language that has to do with obviously the social culture around them as well. But it's really interesting because they've created their own language of sorts for communication. They adapted because they didn't want people to hear what they're saying or see what they're saying and be able to interpret it, good or bad. That's just the reality of what is happening. And we've learned from that. We've learned how they have adapted to their current environment to change their language to communicate with one another, their social circle. So just another example, good, bad, or ugly. That is just the way it is. And so it's an interesting example of how they adapt.
All right. So language learning is so important. And thank you for bringing my attention that it's a big part of how we find belonging, how we feel like we belong with others, how we learn the language, speak the language, sign the language, whatever process we go through. So this has been a fantastic journey into language acquisition. And this was brought to you by the Los Angeles Pacific University Department of Psychology. And this is what learning feels like.